French warship. Okay. Somebody recording. Anyhow, as I was saying, you can see on the cover here a naval action taking place, and it's the art is by Peter Rindlisbacher, who is a very famous North American marine artist, and he just happens to be from the Kingston area as well. He got a PhD from Queen's University here in Kingston. He now lives down in Texas, though. And he's painted this great scene from the first night of the raid. But it's part of the raid that our friend John Bradstreet didn't want anyone to know about. And so that's why I wrote this book. And I first encountered John Bradstreet when I was a young infantry officer, a young captain, and I was sent to Fort Frontenac in Kingston, Ontario, where we have our Army Staff College, sort of like your equivalent of Fort Leavenworth. It was a former artillery barracks. It was converted into a staff college and renamed Fort Frontenac. But what you see just in the foreground of that photo is the original Fort Frontenac, what I call the underground fort. And you see one of the demi-bastions of the fort. And I've also put a map of the street map there, and it shows you quite clearly. This is the demi-bastion that you see on view now, because they dug up the road and they had to redo the traffic circle here. So it's now on view permanently. And you can see that the rest of the fort is underground. But most people in Kingston don't know that there's another part of the fort exposed. And that's the other demi-bastion over on the other side. And when they did archaeology back in the 1950s, when they were building the new Army Staff College, they decided that they would keep this part of the old fort, the old powder magazine, uncovered. And I used to walk past this every day as a young officer on my 6-month course. And one of the days I actually read that plaque there and discovered that a man named John Bradstreet with 3,000 British American provincials had come up in the year 1758 and captured the fort, destroyed it, and then gone back down the lake. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but it explained a lot to me why the building in the back there that you see in the background, that far door, I lived on the 3rd floor of that building, and the name of the building was Bradstreet Block. And basically, Bradstreet Block is up here where I'm pointing, and I was looking down at the old magazine in the Bastion Saint-Louis. But at the time, as a young captain, didn't have time to pursue my interests in military history, too busy running through the fields with a bayonet in my teeth. So I'm going to talk to you for the next 45 minutes. I'm going to break down my talk into sort of 6 manageable chunks. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about who was John Bradstreet, for those of you that don't know who he is. Then I will talk about the Bateau Service, the organization that he put into place during the 7 Years' War that enabled the British and American armed forces to move efficiently and safely through the wilderness to attack French objectives in New France. Then I'll christen the ground. That's an old Army term for showing you the terrain, explaining the geography to you. And so I will do that with the aid of maps because, I'm an Army guy. Bear with me. Then we'll look at the genesis of the raid, look at the raid itself, and then finally some thoughts on the aftermath of the raid and why it was important in American history. So here you have John Bradstreet, or technically it'd be more correct to call him Jean-Baptiste Bradstreet. That was the name he was christened with, because he was the son of Agathe de la Tour, an Acadian mother, and an Anglo-Irish officer by the name of Simon Bradstreet, who died when he was quite young. So his mother fell back on her Acadian relatives. She was well-to-do. Her father had been the former governor of Acadia, Charles de la Tour. And he had taken many native wives when he was governor. Bradstreet's mother had many native stepsisters. And so he grew up as a kid in Annapolis Royal in Nova Scotia, running around with his Mi'kmaq cousins. And he and his brother quite soon were taken on strength of the regiment as sort of regimental boys, and fairly soon their mother got them commissions as ensigns in the 40th Foot. And he had a fairly uneventful early career, but he was well inured to working in the wilderness, working at sea on boats. He actually made enough money smuggling in and out of Louisbourg with New England connections that he could afford to buy his own schooner. And he got involved with Pepperell and Shirley in the 1745 capture of Louisbourg. I think probably his key contribution to it was not formulating the plan, but providing key military intelligence needed as to the defenses, which batteries were manned, morale in the garrison, and that type of thing, because he was sailing in and out of there all the time. Smuggling was sort of the unspoken way that officers in that obscure outpost posting could actually make some money on the side. Now, before I move on to the raid itself and talk about the bateau service that he put in place, this painting is the only known likeness of him, the only known portrait. And actually it was discovered in Schenectady. It was in the attic of a descendant of Martha Bradstreet in an old steamer trunk, and it went up for auction. But here we see him in his 50th year. He's 50 years old. This is well after the raid. And we can date it quite accurately. He is 50 years old in the picture. He's just come back from the 1764 expedition to relieve the siege of Detroit. He's just being raked over the coals by his commander-in-chief for having negotiated unauthorized treaties with the various indigenous tribes around Detroit. He was supposed to wait for Sir William Johnson. So Gage has raked him over the coals. But he looks, I think in this picture, he looks a bit defiant, and it looks unrepentant. He's down half a pint, as you can see, lily white forehead, sort of the wig on, just, he's back in polite society, so he has to wear a wig for this portrait. But he's been wearing his hat scrunched down. He's been 4 months out in open boats, sunburned. He favored an unadorned uniform, like other major commanders like James Wolfe, Sir William Johnson, Lord Howe just wore unadorned red uniform jackets, no gold or fancy lace on them to identify them to enemy sharpshooters. But what's interesting to me, at least in this portrait, knowing the man and having studied him, and this was my screensaver for 2 years while I was writing the book, so I could get to know him. And there's nothing in the background. I mean, he was such a braggart. He was an arrogant man, very boastful. And typically in these portraits of the period, commanders would have their deed of daring do or their exploits or the family castle in the background. Here, completely unadorned background, completely unadorned uniform. He's in decline here. In 10 years, he'll be dead from cirrhosis of the liver, and his, basically, as I said, he's been raked over the coals, and his career is going nowhere at this point after his debacle in Detroit. After the raid in 1758, he was only a lieutenant colonel at the time during the raid, and that led for some problems, or made for some problems on the raid before the raid launch. But I'll get into that later. After the raid, he didn't think he was getting enough praise or recognition. He wasn't getting any promotion. He wasn't getting any preferment. He was promoted colonel anyway, so that promotion had been long on the list. So he really didn't get given a knighthood or anything for his daring raid. And it might be because of some of the things that haven't been actually ever reported about it. Anyhow, he wrote this impartial account, claimed it was written by a volunteer in the expedition, but we all know that it was written by Bradstreet, because I found this out for myself when I was going through the George Washington papers. He and Philip John Schuyler. Philip John Schuyler was mentored by Bradstreet. Bradstreet liked Philip John Schuyler because he spoke fluent French as well, like he did, having been trained in the French language at New Rochelle. And they were fast friends, and Bradstreet was almost like a father figure. That portrait I showed you, that was Philip John Schuyler's wife. Asked him to sit for that. Philip John and his wife had both been painted by the same artist, Thomas Mackleworth, and they wanted a painting of their friend, which is why we have this portrait. But back to the impartial account. This document has been the document used by historians, starting with Francis Parkman, right up to the present day, and they all, in some cases, almost repeat the account word for word as the sort of the gospel of what actually happened on the expedition to Fort Frontenac. Having a journalism background, and having been trained as a journalist, the first thing they teach you is not to accept an account of a story from one person's perspective. In this case, John Bradstreet, the commander. And certainly, you should go back and check all the French sources and versions of it. And my goodness, there was, over 3,000 provincials on the raid as well. Certainly they left journals, diaries, letters, accounts. I combed through all the various county histories of, New York, Massachusetts, what have you. Actually, it was a lot of fun. This was during COVID, and all of the libraries opened their digital collections and what have you. So it was like Christmas every day for me. Now, one of the first things I found when I went back to French sources and I went back to provincial sources was that Bradstreet's account, impartial account, had left out a major part of the raid. Probably because it was his failure, probably because he basically got his proverbial kicked. The first night of the raid, as they crossed over and they landed about a mile and a half away from the fort, he decided after last light he was going to take 20 whaleboats, fill them with Rangers and the New York Regiment. And those whaleboats tried to cut out the two operating French ships that were anchored by the fort. But I don't know that he was just audacious or he thought he might catch them by surprise. But what happened was the ships were dark, sails were furled, but the gun crews were all waiting for them. And they basically were repelled with some expensive life. But when Bradstreet wrote his impartial account and when he wrote his official correspondence, he didn't even mention this as happening at all. And it certainly did happen because the French talked about it, the Rhode Islanders talked about it. And even the engineer, when he sent his report to the Ordnance Board back in England, reporting on the siege and what had happened. He reported it as well. But Bradstreet, he didn't want any mention of that made. And so sort of buried some of the truth of what actually happened during the raid. The focus in the impartial account, too, is all on what Bradstreet did. Bradstreet this, Bradstreet that. Nothing really about the provincial soldiers, the 3,000 men that made it all happen. You know, the men of Massachusetts there on the left in the blue with the red facings, the men from New Jersey, the famous Jersey Blues, and also the New York Regiment, your guys dressed top to toe in green. The New Yorkers, probably Bradstreet's favorite of the provincials that went along. And of course, the Rhode Islanders went along too, and they just counted themselves lucky to have been given a uniform to wear. Now, I went back and I found a whole bunch of orderly books as well. And one of the orderly books I used was Goose Van Skeek orderly book, which is now owned by the, excuse me, by the Fort Ticonderoga Museum. So I was able to get facsimile pages of that orderly book and transcribe it and follow the New York Regiment as it went on this raid, and then it came back. And very interesting orderly book. Half of it's already been published in the Bulletin of the Fort Ticonderoga Museum. The second half will be published shortly. Now, and of course, that's the Van Skeek house over at Cohoes. Now, so you know who John Bradstreet is now, and we need to know a little bit about the bateau service that he put in place. Now, here are the draft plans for the colonial military bateau, which the British Admiralty by 1776 had formalized into an actual blueprint plan so that, you know, they could build them anywhere. And essentially, this was the workhorse of Bradstreet's bateau service that he put into place starting in 1755, and basically built an operational capability for the British American Army. Bateaus were usually anywhere from 20 to 45 feet long. Ones that were used on inland waters could have a slightly lower thwarts on the sides. If you were going to go out on a rough lake like Lake Ontario or Lake Erie, you wanted to have a bateau that had slightly higher sides on it. Now, what made the bateau great for use on inland waterways, especially the Mohawk, Wood Creek, Onondaga River, was because they had flat bottoms. They had flat bottoms. They could, at a portage, they could be rolled on logs. They could be stacked, and they didn't have a keel. They could be stacked. The bottoms, the flat bottoms that were dragged across rocks, or if you were running down white water, the bottoms were made out of white oak, out of hardwood, and then the sides were made out of pine, softer wood, so that it wouldn't be as heavy. But the bottom had to be strong because it took a lot of punishment. Sometimes going down through the white water, the pine would get stove in. So they carried tar and caulking and pitch with them, so that and replacement staves, so that they could repair boats after particularly treacherous stretches of water. Now, he organized bateaus. Bradstreet organized the bateaus into companies of 50 men each, commanded by a captain. According to wherever the bateaus were built, he had them built in Albany, he had them built in Schenectady. Every region had its own design and style. Some, the Albany boats were smaller than the Schenectady boats. Some were wider, some were skinnier. For fun, I threw in a giraffe plan of the bateaus that were used to bring the loyalists up to Kingston, Ontario. And you can see if we can move that out of the way, you can see in the diagram or in the notes on the plan, you can see that this one is a 45-footer bateau and would have been used to bring loyalist families up after the War of Independence. They could be fitted with the sail. They could be fitted with swivel gun on the front for anti-personnel purposes. And then the other boat that Bradstreet used, at least his reconnaissance forces and his scouts, his rangers, and his Haudenosaunee that came on the raid with him, used their war canoes. But here you see some rangers on a whaleboat, slightly smaller than the bateau, slightly different build. It actually had a keel, and these were built by Massachusetts men that came up from Massachusetts. Okay, we're now going to christen the ground. We're going to start getting you, give you some context before we dive straight into the raid. North American Theater of Operations. I'm assuming that most of you have a fairly good understanding of the 7 Years' War, when it was fought. This is the war before the American War of Independence. It's where some people blame George Washington for having started the French and Indian War. He certainly didn't start it. It was coming along for quite a long time, but it was the first time that regulars, both sides from the two mother countries, actually came. Up until then, all the wars in North America had been fought by proxy, by the colonists, the habitants and the Canadiens of Quebec fighting against the various settlers and colonists of New England, what have you. Now, the thing about strategy that you have to understand, that basically Quebec down to Montreal here was the sort of the center of gravity for New France. If you captured that, everything else fell. And so that was the focus of the planners back in Whitehall across the ocean. And they basically, for the year 1758, they wanted to attack Quebec City using the Gulf of St. Lawrence, coming in, passed through Newfoundland and Nova Scotia here. But there was the great French fortress at Louisbourg, which the British did not want to bypass and leave in their rear. So they had to take Louisbourg first. So in 1758, Amherst was given that as his job. Abercrombie was given the job of capturing Fort Carillon, Fort Ticonderoga, just north, almost due north of Schenectady and Albany there, the Hudson River, on this direction, this approach to New France on the Lake George, Lake Champlain corridor. Let's drill down, right down into the area where the raid took place, and a closer look at Ticonderoga in relation to Albany and Schenectady, where you guys are. The Mohawk River runs. Canada Creek and the Mohawk River are in this water basin that feeds the Hudson River Valley and this side of New York State. When you get up to Rome, New York, up where they built Fort Stanwix, you're at the Oneida Carrying Place. It's that height of land there is about 3 to 4 miles across to Wood Creek. And Wood Creek runs down into a different watershed, down into the Oneida Lake, down into the Oneida River, Onondaga River, Oswego River, down to Oswego and into Lake Ontario. And then these Moose River and these other Oswegatchie River all feed down as well, different part. So you've got this height of land right here, very important strategic choke point, and that's where they're going to build Fort Stanwix. And at Fort Stanwix, this is where the raid began, and this is where the raid ended. Now, Bradstreet comes to Oswego in 1755 at the invitation of his old buddy, William Shirley, who is now the commander-in-chief in North America, having replaced the dead Braddock, who falls at Monongahela. And he is charged with prosecuting the war against New France for the remainder of 1755 and 56. And what you see here is Oswego, and this is sort of the first time that John Bradstreet or Jean-Baptiste saw Lake Ontario. He came to Oswego as a logistician, and his main job was to bring supplies to build a new fort up on this height of land just behind his portrait. They were building a new fort up there, Fort Ontario. And there's a couple other forts up on the high old trading post forts. There's a old palisade up there. And traders' houses. You see the army camps down in here. You see some boat building going on in Oswego Harbor. Of course, it doesn't look anything like this nowadays. In 1756, when John Bradstreet is busting his butt getting shipbuilding supplies and cannon down for the new forts and food, and running up and down the Mohawk River and Wood Creek to get those vital supplies to get Oswego jump-started. Montcalm and his French army come down in 1756 and quickly capture all of Oswego, capture the entire British fleet, burn the ships that are still on the stock being built. But Bradstreet is not captured along with the garrison of the forts or anyone at Oswego, because he's sort of stuck basically halfway between Oswego and Albany on one of his provision runs. So 1758 is the year. It's the year of the raid. And what you see here are the two theater commanders. On the left, you have General James Abercrombie, a Scot who had been acting as a second in command to the previous commander, Lord Loudon, and was acknowledged by most people as a good second man anywhere, which was a sort of a compliment to his ability as a logistician and an administrator, not as a commander of men. On the right, you have the Marquis Pierre Rigaud de Vaudreuil, the Governor General of New France. His father had been a Governor General of New France, 2 appointments previous to him. He'd served in his youth as an officer in the Compagnie Franche de la Marine. He was quite a narcissistic, arrogant man who thought that he knew the right tactics and strategy to use, and was constantly at loggerheads with Montcalm and the French regular troops that had come over from France. Vaudreuil was all about la petite guerre, whereas the French regulars wanted to concentrate on defending New France. And so there was divisions between the French command. Abercrombie, on the other hand, was seconded by Lord Howe, who was a very able officer. I just threw this map in here because I like it. It shows Schenectady and Albany. Albany was, of course, the city where all of the regiments congregated and assembled for the big 1758 campaign. And you had people quartered over on this side of the river. In Greenbush, you had folks down all the way down below Albany. You had Williams, Massachusetts Regiment was garrisoned in Schenectady. New Yorkers were down in Half Moon, Saratoga, up at Fort Hunter. And when Abercrombie took his 15,000-man army north to Ticonderoga in July and his subsequent defeat, this is where they launched from. But he sent Williams, Massachusetts men, and he sent the New York independent companies up the river, as well as some companies of the New Yorkers. And he put them under a man by the name of Charles Clinton, told him that he should start surveying and picking a good site for a new fort, which would take its name from the general tasked to build the fort, General Stanwix. And that's up at present day Rome, New York. So when you get up to the end of the Mohawk River, or the navigable part of it, in your bateaus, you get out that height of land I was talking about, the Oneida carrying place. We're in Oneida territory now. And this is where the various forts at various stages had been built to protect the carry from attack by the French. You can see a fort at Newport, Fort Newport. You see, this is actually, Fort Stanwix hasn't been built yet, but when they actually built Fort Stanwix in 1758, they built it on the site of Webb's camp, where he was encamped in 1757. And everybody's seen the movie Last of the Mohicans. Webb was the cowardly general who basically panicked, and he ordered all of these forts destroyed, all of them. He ordered all the trees on either side of this sort of 3-mile stretch of Wood Creek felled on either side, and the trees were quite large, which then fell into the river, creating it impassable for a French force coming up. So that allegedly was the reason why he ordered them cut down. So the raid started at the Carry. Of the 5,600 men that Abercrombie sent to build the fort, he gave John Bradstreet 3,000 men. He gave him 160 regulars of the New York Independents. They were regulars, but they were an independent company permanently stationed in New York. The American provincials from, as I've said before, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New Jersey, and New York. The artillery were regulars. There was 26 of them. It was all the artillery that Abercrombie had left, because he had to send most of his artillery to Amherst, taking Louisburg. So this was 8 pieces of artillery. As you can see down there at the bottom, there's a little tally of what guns and armament they took with them. Rangers, battalion, and essentially those were American colonists, American provincials. When I say American, I mean they're colonists. They were not British regulars. They were recruited locally. A lot of the battalion were recruited from New York Colony. And of course, the Six Nation contingent of 42 warriors. The 42 warriors were very important. Bradstreet wasn't impressed. He thought that was sort of a slight on him, that only 42 wanted to come on his raid. Sir William Johnson had brought almost 500 to Ticonderoga. But those Haudenosaunee that had gone to Fort Ticonderoga had seen the defeat of the British Army. They weren't really too excited about going on another attack against a fort. But that it was very important that they were there. All Six Nations were represented on the raid. And it really didn't matter whether you had 6 or 600 Haudenosaunee with you. You had all Six Nations represented. And they were out in the canoes and with the whaleboats and the rangers out in front, you know, and if they'd encountered any indigenous forces on their way, they would have seen the Six Nations, and just by that would have known that they were witnessing a Six Nations sanctioned event. Now, let me talk a little bit about one of the several myths of the raid. In his impartial account, Bradstreet said he totally surprised the French, which is utter bull roar. because Payan de Noyen, the commandant, was a blood brother of Onondaga, and they kept him well informed of events that were going on to the south. His cousin, who was the Sieur de Longueuil, who had been down amongst the Seneca, also came back about 3 weeks before the raid, told him that there's an expedition being mounted and they've got guns with them. And it can't be Fort Niagara because Fort Niagara's in Seneca land. They don't have the diplomatic clearance to take a force through Seneca land. So it has to be you here at Fort Frontenac. So you better be on your toes. So Payan de Noyen, who's a 68-year-old captain, Company French de la Marine, very experienced veteran. He's also the lieutenant of Trois-Rivières, sort of like the third or fourth man in the colony. However, bon vivant, in debt, and is just happens to be at the fort because the governor thinks that he might be able to recoup some of his money by, a lucrative job commanding Fort Frontenac. It's a backwater. Nothing much happens there. But he writes a letter off immediately to Vaudreuil when his cousin tells him this intelligence, and Vaudreuil sort of gets the letter and sort of turns to one of his staff officers and says, what is this officer so afraid about? And it's really arrogance on the part of Vaudreuil, because he has assumed that because they've destroyed Oswego in 1756, there's no way the English can launch an attack either against Fort Frontenac or Niagara, because they don't have any ships on the lake, and he has 2 warships at Fort Frontenac. He also has another 7 warships, but they've all had the rigging taken off, and they're sort of in the harbor behind the fort. And they're only using the 2 biggest forts to run the supply run to Niagara and to Fort Toronto. So just to recap and get you back oriented, the raid launches here from the Oneida carrying place. It takes them 5 days to get down to Oswego. These falls here takes them 3 days to get around the Oswego Falls. They're not there anymore. They're some hydroelectric. But they were quite tall. They were about 20 feet tall in their day, and a major river obstacle. And they had to get everything out and roll it around and down the hill and around and back down to Oswego. And in Oswego, they launched from Oswego on the they launched from Oswego on the 22nd. Hugging the coastline and all the way up the eastern side of Lake Ontario. And they make it to Sackett's Harbor the first day, and it takes them then another 2 days to get up to Kingston, Fort Frontenac, and this is Wolf Island here. And sort of on the third night, by Friday morning, they're up here behind these 2 small islands. Huge northerly winds hindering them on both of these legs. The men are really, really exhausted, really tired. Speaking of the men, here are the gunners that went. They took howitzers, and they also took 12-pounders, and these are brass, and you can see the gun cases there. 53 Marines manned the fort, and against them were coming 3,000 provincials. This provincial on the right cut down his tricorn hat so they don't get knocked about in the woods or the boats. He's cut down his musket. The barrels have been blued. He's got a bearskin bedroll. His jacket has been cut down. He's wearing what were known as Indian leggings, or matasses, as the French called them, in moccasins. 3,000 against 53. But the French had the combat multiplier, because Bradstreet's main concern was that the French fleet could intercept his boats when they were on Lake Ontario. And that's why, one of the reasons why he hugged the eastern shore of Lake Ontario. The other reason, of course, being squalls, for any of you that have sailed on Lake Ontario, squalls can come up pretty quick, and the lake is not that deep. Here was the earliest map of Fort Frontenac by the British, where it says head of the River St. Lawrence. That's not the head of the River St. Lawrence. That's the Cataraqui River emptying into the St. Lawrence. St. Lawrence is much bigger than just that, but it just shows you how ignorant the British were on where the fort actually was located. They had no real maps of the area. And so they came in their small boats. They had to be guided, of course, by the Haudenosaunee, who'd been many times into the trading settlement of Fort Frontenac. French garrison of 53 regulars, but they also had 65 employees, and that was everything, including women and children, but that was the armor, the baker, the coopers. There was about 20 voyageurs there with the boat convoy. There was the doctor. And all the guys working in the King's stores. I have not included in the total of 118 garrison, the crews of the two French ships, because we don't know how many they were. They were on the ships. They weren't in the fort when the fort surrendered. They were on the ships and they escaped. But part of the ship's crew were a detachment of gunners from Fort Niagara, because when Bradstreet and his guys were coming up, the two ships were doing their runs. The Vaudreuil came in the day before Bradstreet arrives up here. The Vaudreuil arrives fully laden with fur from Fort Frontenac, and the other ship, the old HMS Halifax, which has been renamed the Montcalm, is full of Indian goods and muskets and gunpowder, and it's about to do its run across the lake to supply Fort Niagara. So both those ships fully laden but manned and beefed up with some gunners from Fort Niagara end up being the ship's artillery that are used. So on the night of Friday the 25th, they land at A. And that's basically in Kingston now. That's where the university, Queen's University, and the hospital are located, just out of range, artillery range of the fort. In the morning at C, they move all their artillery boats and some of their boats around to where the Kingston Yacht Club is now located at C. And they set up howitzer batteries at D to lob shells into Fort Frontenac. At B, you'll see the whale. That's the whale boats going up after last light. The first night that they arrive, Bradstreet takes up 20 whale boats and tries to cut out the Vaudreuil, which is basically essentially a floating battery. They're anchored on either side of the fort here. The other ships anchored as well, but these two ships are manned and the guns are operable, guarding the two flanks of the fort, preventing the British from just sailing right around into the back of the fort. So this fails, so they scuttle back to camp. And then the next day, Bradstreet and his engineer follow this checked line, this route up to the high ground just to the west of Fort Frontenac. Now, you may have noticed that in some of my slides, I have a little banner across the top of the thingy, and that is actually a 1783 view of what Frontenac looked like before the Loyalists came. And so the ground I'm talking about is that high ground that you see up on the wood line there. This area, all that cleared area around the fort, was for fields of fire. And all of the houses that you see were not there before 1783. All these houses that you see are prefab houses that were brought over from Carleton Island, which is now part of the United States. So the first day is basically wrecking. And on the Saturday night, the troops, Bradstreet divides his troops into three forces. One force to guard the landing place and the gun batteries here. Another force to take post at the old French breastworks and pierce holes through for guns to fire down onto the fort. This is where Kingston's current city hall is basically located. And then up on the high ground here, they build a 2-gun battery that can almost look right down on the ship and the fort here. And then at the next morning, at first light, which was approximately around 5:30 in the morning, they chop down all the trees that are in front of the Fascine battery that they build up here. They unmask the battery and they open fire. And almost immediately they did almost totally demolish that demi-bastion that I showed you at the very beginning of my presentation. And these guns open up as well. And at about 8 o'clock, these two ships unfurl their sails and look like they're going to try and make an escape, but really they can't because it's too calm, and the wind actually is blowing from the southwest to the northeast. So the ships this ship gets raked and then drifts back, and both ships are abandoned, and the crews escape to the land using their boats. So the 118 folks in the fort are the ones that surrender. They surrender at 9 o'clock as soon as they see the ships gone, because the ships represent half of the firepower of the French position. Also, the morale of the folks inside is gone. One of the shells hits the chapel. One of the howitzer shell hits a chapel where all the women and children are sheltering. Doesn't kill any of them, but it shatters the altar. And of course, there's much lamentation. The evening of Sunday, after the fort has capitulated in the morning, Bradstreet orders all the unrigged ships to be burned, and they're burned with their contents, and they still lie at the bottom of Cataraqui Harbor and behind Kingston. And one of the interesting things I found in the capitulation of the fort was that for the 118 inhabitants or soldiers and civilians that surrendered, the commandant agreed that prisoners of war held in Quebec and Montreal would be freed, people of equivalent ranks and occupations, so that if a surgeon is being freed by Bradstreet, because he basically lets all of the inhabitants get in their canoes. They have voyageurs with them, and they take their own French bateaux down the river, and 3 days later they're all in Montreal telling their side of the story. But what I thought was interesting is one of the 118 New Englanders that is freed is Susanna Johnson, of course, of the famous for her captivity narrative, perhaps one of the most famous captivity narratives written. And she and her son, Sylvanus Johnson, are amongst the captives that are redeemed and released by the surrender of Fort Frontenac. And this book of hers goes through 22 printings. In it, she writes of her son, Sylvanus. He was captured when he's 4 years old. Speaks only Abneki, doesn't speak English anymore, has gone completely native. And for most of the rest of his life would choose to live like a native, but he went back to his neighborhood. Another myth I want to address is the myth of no casualties. Bradstreet said he only had one guy killed on the raid. And though right at the beginning of the impartial account, he talks about how two of his guys in the recce party are killed by Indians who discover them on the island as they're making their way down to Oswego. So again, I found major things that happened on the raid that he doesn't even report. He glosses over them, or he just leaves them out completely. And one of the people that he leaves out in the impartial account are his provincial soldiers, those 3,000 men that row the boats up and row the boats back and tow the guns into place and shell the fort. They get no acknowledgement whatsoever in Bradstreet's impartial account. On the left is an excerpt of a letter written by General Stanwix to Abercrombie after the men returned on the 3rd of September. This is written on the 29th. The men have been back now for a couple of weeks, and they're dying in droves. They're dropping down dead daily. So Bradstreet didn't want to address the fact that he perhaps had driven them so hard that, I mean, when the men came back, their constitutions were destroyed. They were suffering from nervous exhaustion. Many men died as well, just coming back up the Oswego River. Charles Clinton described trying to get those bateaus back up Wood Creek and up back to the Oneida carrying place as vast slavery. Now, one of the most important things to come out of the raid with the capture of the 2 French ships, because the 2 French ships that try to escape and then they float back into the French harbor here, they either run aground on Île au Père here or this side of the Cataraqui River. They refloat those the next day, probably jettisoning most of the guns because they don't need guns anymore. There's no other warships on the lake, to get them off the mud, because Cataraqui actually means the place of the mud in Haudenosaunee. They get those 2 ships. They're already loaded with guns and gunpowder and fur from Niagara, so they don't really have to load any loot onto the ships, but they do load all their artillery back on, plus some British artillery that they find at the fort. They load that on. They aren't able to get out the next day because that headwind is still coming against them. But one of the most important things is you look at this French map that was captured on one of those 2 ships. This is a map by the Sieur de la Braquerie, and it shows soundings. It's one of the first hydrographic maps of Lake Ontario. And basically, they found maps that showed all of the harbors with the soundings, where the sandbars are located, hazards, best anchorages, all done to scale, and basically gave them instant intelligence and awareness of Lake Ontario. And the next year, critical for Sir William Johnson and Prideaux's force going to capture Fort Niagara, because here what you have here is the exact coastline to scale all the way to Niagara, which is the route that Johnson and Prideaux's army would take, and they would be successful in capturing Niagara the following year at 1759. Equally so, maps showing detailed soundings of the St. Lawrence River here. Here you see one of the very few naval actions that took place on the St. Lawrence River. I can think of only 2, and this is one of them. And here you see 5 galleys or gunboats, where each one has a gun in the front. And these 5 gunboats capture one of the 2 French warships that Vaudreuil builds after the raid to replace all the ones that Bradstreet burns. In the background, you can just see Amherst's army coming down the river on their way to Montreal. Now, the French never rebuilt Fort Frontenac after the raid. This is Fort Oswegatchie, and they set up base at Oswegatchie, where there was a large settlement of Christianized Haudenosaunee, mainly Oneida, Onondaga, and Cayuga. This is a painting by Thomas Davies, a gunner, from sketches that he took in 1760. So I'm going to sum up here now. The legacy really for Bradstreet was that he put in place an operational capability that enabled, he was an innovator, he was a shaker and a mover. He was a logistician first and foremost. He put in place a bateau service that was then used to good effect for 1758, 1759. And for the descent here, shown here, this is another Thomas Davies sketch. It's the cover of one of my other books, showing the British American Army confidently going down the Long Sault Rapids. They've got their bateaumen with them. You can see their weapons stashed in front of their bateaus. You can see their Haudenosaunee counterparts in their war canoe. And I just like to finish off with a painting by my friend Peter Rindlisbacher, and a painting done by James Peachy in 1783 showing Fort Frontenac. And you can just see the ruins. There's the tower I used to see every morning out of my window and walk by on my way to the mess. You can see the ruined demi-bastions. All the houses, the prefab houses bought over from Carleton Island. A couple of Anishinaabe canoes here in the front, and a longboat from this ship, which they believe is the Seneca, commanded by the same guy who commanded the Marquise de Vaudreuil during the 1758 raid. He's the only guy I could find in 1783 still around that had been present during the 1758 raid. At the time, he was the French Commodore. Well, fast forward now to 1783. He during the American Revolution, he's French Canadian, of course, but he is now a British subject, and he is the Commodore commanding the British ships you see here sailing on Lake Ontario. Not big double deckers, or triple deckers, but fast, speedy warships. So in 1783, the British come back to Kingston. But in 1758, for all intents and purposes, Fort Frontenac destroyed. The French never came back. So the French regime ended in Kingston in 1758. So I'd be happy to take any questions now.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. And I do see some questions already in the chat log. So folks, if you have questions, now's the time to ask them. We will go through them in chronological order. So the sooner you ask, the sooner they'll get answered. And let's see, let's start at the very beginning here. So we have a question from Mark Familier asking about how boats were moved from Albany to Lake Ontario. Did it require overland transport? Now, I think that this was addressed, but we can just kind of refresh that question real quick.
Okay, so he's asking, how did they get from
Albany to Lake Ontario? I think you had a slide on it earlier on in the presentation.
How did they rode in them? I mean, they used them. They went up the Mohawk. They used the portage at the Oneida Carry, and then they put them back in the water, and then they went down Wood Creek and down Lake Oneida and down, only getting out at Oswego Falls and then getting down to Oswego. At Oswego, they spent 2 days at Oswego, spent enough time there to reload everything because they were going from a narrow riverine area out onto an open lake, so they had to stow stuff, and of course they'd had a lot of injuries as well on the way down, so the sick layman lays, they sorted that all out. The interesting thing is that Lake Ontario, of course, being the lowest of the 5 Great Lakes, all of the water from the 4 Great Lakes via Niagara escarpment and the gorge there comes into Lake Ontario and creates a huge countercurrent, anti-clockwise countercurrent in Lake Ontario. And the first day that Bradstreet launches, his boats are in that current. That's why they make a good 40 miles and get up to Sackett's Harbor. They're rowing and they're sailing, and they make 40 miles the first day. And then the next 2 days they have headwinds, so they can't use their sails. The current is against them. So as I say again, they arrive probably pretty zombie-like on the Saturday. The Saturday is a day they can rest as they get into position, and while Bradstreet figures out how he's going to crack his nut of getting the fort, because he's got 8 guns with him, yeah, but he only has limited ammunition, and he has limited siege tools, and he has limited powder. So he's got to do this quick, and he's got to be in and out. And the other thing that he's doing is he's looking over his right shoulder, or he's looking down the St. Lawrence River all the time, worried that reinforcements are going to come up the river from Oswegatchie. And in fact, the Mississauga and the Haudenosaunee send 150 warriors up from Oswegatchie, but they meet one of the French officers sent down from the fort with dispatches for Vaudreuil. He tells them to turn back because the British are already landed in there, and they're not really going to be able to help. So, yeah, I don't think that really answers. Well, I mean, they went in the boats. I mean, they went up the river in the boats. And the only time they were out of the boats was at the Oneida carrying place, and at Oswego Falls, and at Oswego itself, where they had sort of their last make and mend, where they had to pitch and caulk boats again before going out onto the one of the Great Lakes, which can be very nasty at times. Good. That's all I want to say on that.
Okay, great. So the next question comes from, I think this is Bill Buell's question. Was the Canadian citizenry still mostly French in the 1750s or British? Do we know the breakdown of the population?
Which population are we talking about?
Canadian population.
Oh, the Canadian population was all French. It was Canada did not exist. It was called New France, and it was all French. There was no British. No British in Quebec. Now, of course, what happens is during when France surrenders in 1763, Quebec becomes becomes the 14th colony. We have the 13 colonies. It essentially becomes the 14th British colony, and a lot of New Englanders move in, sort of like carpetbaggers at the end of your Civil War. New Englanders move into Quebec and Montreal for all the trade, the fur trade, basically. They can get involved in that. Various companies and speculation going on, land as well, land speculation. But the French become integrated through the Quebec Act. Basically, the seigneurial class are amalgamated into British society. The French are allowed to keep their religion. The French are allowed to keep their laws. They're allowed to, and they form militias that then serve the British king. They become British subjects, essentially. So you have French-speaking British subjects. So this is why the Sieur de la Force, the captain of the Marquis de Vaudreuil in 1758, is fighting for the French. Then years later, during the American Revolution, he is now the senior naval commander on Lake Ontario, commanding the British. I think it's the only time ever in North American history where a naval captain has fought first for the French, and then fought for the side that he was fighting against in the First War. They have it.
All right, great. So we do have one last question from the audience. From Mark again. Did you find many primary sources for the book from this time period, or is there little written?
Well, I think historians have been lazy in sort of digging around and finding out more about what actually happened on this expedition. They've all been content to just take at face value what Bradstreet wrote about the account. And of course, John Keegan, the famous military historian, says the worst thing you can do is let a commander write his own account about how a campaign or expedition went, because he's going to make sure that he either looks, if it was really bad, he's going to make it look as good as possible, and he's going to gloss it over as much as possible. Now, in this case, he made a big fuss about how he achieved total surprise, how he had no casualties, basically only one guy killed. when we know for a fact that close to 1,000 men died as a result of this raid. Because when they got back to Stanwix, smallpox had already broken out. A lot of these men caught typhus. They caught what's the other things? Dysentery. And this is what they were dying of. And it was mainly because they were just so nervously exhausted from basically dashing up the Frontenac and dashing back.
Yeah, I was surprised to hear that figure of nearly 1,000 casualties, and I'd never heard of that before.
No, the other thing that you don't learn about, because no one focuses, because it's always considered to be an adjunct to the Ticonderoga campaign. This is something that Abercrombie let his subordinate go off and do, hoping perhaps maybe that success, a huge success, would help ameliorate his disaster at Ticonderoga, because Ticonderoga has this disastrous defeat. Him thinking that perhaps the only way out of it is if he can have a victory somewhere else. So yeah, Abercrombie, I think that's why Abercrombie authorized it, but he didn't authorize it as part of an operational plan. There was no what I would call a follow-on plan. If it was successful and he did capture ships, why didn't he keep a couple of the ships? Because then the British would have had the only 2 operating warships on Lake Ontario. They would have had immediate naval superiority. They could have kept them cruising. They could have interdicted supplies to Fort Niagara. He didn't have authority to go on to Fort Niagara because that had to be negotiated with the Haudenosaunee. But he later would claim, and it's a partial count, that he had proposed this they should go and take Fort Niagara as well. And you know, when you think about it, he had 2 French warships. He had French colors that he could fly on those 2 French warships. He could dress guys up on deck, and he could do a real ruse de guerre and sail right up to the King's Wharf at Fort Niagara, and the next thing you know, Fort Niagara is in the bag as well. And you know, a lot of people said, yeah, but of course, the bigger picture is that you can't just take a large armed force through Indigenous folks' land without, riling a few people up, rubbing them the wrong way. So there you go. I think most people have left now, haven't they? Or are they just silent there?
Well, we still have 29 people in the chat. Looks like some people are filtering out. Looks like
okay. Just about other primary sources other than Bradstreet. Going back to primary sources, I went back to French primary sources, did a lot of translation, got some of my French Canadian friends in the military to help with the archaic French, but translated a journal, translated letters. There's a lot of French correspondence as well in documents relative to the colonial history of New York. A lot of them have been translated poorly, so I had to retranslate some. The list of prisoners by name is in the documents relative to the colonial history of New York. I was able to find the original French document, match it up with that one, found 15, 20 typos, names misspelled, names left off. So